Coming up on Choppers Politics, what's good for their base is going on about independence whenever they're in trouble and anything else. So whether it's the salmon sturgeon case, which to me, excuse the pun, looks a bit fishy, whether it's
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Choppers Politics. Now, a cold snap has seen much of the country this week covered in snow, but don't worry, listeners, we won't leave you out in the cold. We have two thought-provoking interviews to get you fired up as you wrap up against the chill this week. Later we'll be talking to Professor Corinne Fowler, an academic at Leicester University, advising the National Trust about why she thinks uncovering the UK's imperial past isn't meant to shame modern-day Britons. A hot topic indeed. But first, you asked, we listened. We've had a lot, and I mean a lot, of emails asking us to take a closer look at the possibility of Scotland leaving the Union. So as much of the country is under a blanket of snow, we wanted to ask, will the SNP get their referendum? Or has COVID put plans of independence on ice? So I asked Secretary of State for Scotland, Alister Jack, to sit down, at a distance of course, and talk about the Scottish Tories, Nicola Sturgeon, and the very state of the Union. Alister Jack, thank you for inviting the podcast into your palatial office in London.
Well, thank you for coming. It's great to see you.
The Union. Shouldn't Brexit make it stronger?
Yes.
So why isn't it?
Well, I think it's weakened it because, as you know, 62% vote for Remain in Scotland. And I think an awful lot of people in the middle, if you break down, there's 33% of firm unionists and 33% of firm nationalists, and then there's the 33% or 34%, it must be, in the middle who are softer unionists. And a number of them will be quite angry about Brexit. But I think once we get Brexit into the rearview mirror and we start to show the great things that the UK government can do, particularly in the pandemic recovery, and through the UKIM powers that we have, which are very important spending powers, putting us in the place of the EU, I think people will begin to see the benefits. And hopefully, as I say, as the pain of Brexit to those people who were passionate about it dulls, they will see the benefits of the United Kingdom. We're one United Kingdom. We have one currency. We have one Bank of England underpinning all that. And we have to, I think, get back our passion for the United Kingdom. I mean, it's very important. The Prime Minister is everything he does, all the agenda that I get involved with him and the items that come up in Cabinet, whether it was shipbuilding today or it's jobs, or everything is about building back better and stronger and strengthening the Union. It's so important to him.
Where's that passion gone, do you think? And how can you find it again? Is there something wrong with that passion? But it's a Little Englander thing, isn't it, that some might describe it as?
Well, I think we've been very distracted with the pandemic. I think we've been very distracted getting Brexit over the finishing line and getting out of the transition period. But the passion is absolutely there. I mean, it's back at the forefront of everything this government's going to do. Every Whitehall department has been written to and told to get focus on strengthening the Union. And it's not, you say Little Englander, and it's a very fair accusation. I think the Scottish nationalists, ironically, have tried to portray the UK government as being xenophobic through Brexit, and they're anything but xenophobic. We want to be a global Britain. We've got the climate change conference coming up in Glasgow in November, the UK government leading that for the UN. We want to show our passion for the environment, for climate change. We want to do global trade deals with countries all around the world. These are huge things and opportunities for us, and it shows that we are an outward-looking nation.
I've seen on a lot of the clips, the Zoom calls, ministers have a union flag behind them now. Is that an order from number 10?
Not remotely, no. I mean, so I have both. If you look over there at my desk, I have the Saltire and the Union Jack. But this flag thing, we don't want to get overexcited about the flag thing, okay? Strengthening the Union is about spending across the whole of the United Kingdom and levelling up across the whole of the United Kingdom and showing the benefits of the UK Treasury to enhance and improve people's lives.
So levelling up means really England, doesn't it? Because the Scots get more per head, don't they, than England, for example?
Well, so spending in Scotland is £129 a head, so it is higher, yes. £129 over 100, so it's £29 a head higher. So it is higher. I agree with that. But that that's not the issue here. The issue about levelling up is looking at the regeneration funds that we'll bring forward, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. It's about union connectivity. So we've just had Sir Peter Hendy's review into how we can take better transport connectivity across the whole of the United Kingdom. And as you know, transport connectivity leads to economic growth. I mean, that was proved by the Victorians with the railways. We know we need to improve our air, road and rail network across the United Kingdom. I was disappointed that the Scottish Government, the Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson, told his officials not to engage with Sir Peter Hendy's review. I mean, this is money coming from UK government, whether it's road improvement or taking HS2 north to Glasgow and Edinburgh or even further on, or enhancing airports, even like Wick, for instance, where you can get a public service obligation in place. These things are really important to the north of the country.
So the Hendy review was about big infrastructure on transport.
Yeah, it hasn't reported yet, but it's entirely about that. And it will be reporting soon. And I think, he's the chairman of Network Rail. He gets transport. I think he'll bring forward some fantastic proposals.
Will it mention the Boris Bridge to Northern Ireland?
Well, you say bridge, I say tunnel.
Well, that's better.
I think a bridge would be closed for probably 100 days a year with the weather in the Irish Sea. But he has, in the review, he has been tasked to look at the idea of a connection between the south of Scotland and Northern Ireland. He has been tasked to look at that, and that will be in his report.
And it will be a tunnel or a bridge, you think?
Well, no, I'm not jumping the gun.
Connection.
No. Whether or not he thinks a connection is feasible, whether or not he thinks a feasibility study should happen, or whether he thinks it should be a tunnel or a bridge, my strong inclination would be that he thinks it should be a tunnel, because he and I have had conversations about the weather patterns in the Irish Sea and Beaufort's Dyke, and there's a munitions deposit there. Tunnels deal with all those problems, should he go for it. But let's wait and see. I don't think we should jump the gun.
When's his report out?
I think, well, he's reported to the Prime Minister, so I think, I suspect, I don't know is the answer, but I suspect it'll be in the next month or two, because he's had his sort of final meeting with the Prime Minister to then brush up the detail.
Are you keen on this idea of putting Union Jacks on bridges and sort of just trying to let Scottish people understand the value of a union? Literally, and this is a bridge we've made from the cash from London, rather than the way that Brussels did, of course.
Well, I think, the irony is that the great love of the EU in Scotland may be linked to the way they branded their projects. I've said it's not all about flags, but I think a sign saying who paid for a specific project, which is what the EU do, is perfectly reasonable. I think that's perfectly reasonable. But what matters more to me is that the infrastructure is built rather than who brands it.
On fisheries, that's one of the key areas where the Scots did so well and the Scottish Tories did so well at the last election. How can you make sure that gets sorted out soon?
Well, there have been challenges around the bureaucracy as we've changed, but the bigger companies, so for instance in the salmon farming industry, who were used to exporting to third world countries, outside the EU, have not found the difficulties that others did.
You mean third country? Third
country exporters who exported beyond the EU, they've understood what paperwork and detail was required, and they've broadly got on with it. Others have found it more difficult. There have been issues around groupage, so smaller consignments grouped into one vehicle, and maybe paperwork from one of those consignments not being correct. That's led to difficulties. But we have a task force we've set up, Seafood Task Force. It's chaired by one of my junior ministers, David Juckett. And we've invited the Scottish Government onto that task force, because obviously the Lark Hall hub, where these vehicles go through and get clearance, is managed by them. That part is devolved. So we want to work with the industry, work with the Scottish Government, and just resolve these issues as quickly as possible.
Are they taking part, the Scottish Government?
We've invited them to take part, and they haven't said no. I think we can expect positive engagement from them.
Can I ask you about Boris Johnson? What's the problem with Scots and Boris Johnson? We're told down here that he doesn't play very well up north.
Well, my experience of trips north with him, and I've done half a dozen now, is that he is, wherever he goes, his optimism and his keenness to project, and this is really his angle on this, the benefits that Scotland bring to the United Kingdom, the values that Scotland bring to the United Kingdom. I mean, that goes down very well. I know the Scottish Nationalist Government don't want to project him in a good light. Why would they? They get up every day and go to work and think, what can I do today to destroy the United Kingdom? That's what they exist for. They're a campaigning organisation to break up the United Kingdom. So they're never going to portray the Prime Minister in a good light. But the reality is his heart is 100% in the right place. He loves Scotland. As you know, he went there for last summer on holiday. So he loves the West Coast. He doesn't.
Is he going this summer?
Well, he doesn't love the midges so much, but he loves the West Coast. He is all about what Scotland brings, whether it's through oil and gas, through renewables, green energy, whether it's whiskey exports. There's a host of things, endless things, the research at universities, et cetera, that Scotland brings to the as a valued member of the Union, and he gets it.
Is it him personally? Does he wind them up a bit?
No, he's not winding anyone up. I mean, he doesn't say things to wind up the Scots at all. I mean, historically, if you look at his name, he's a lowland Scot himself.
Is he? Well, he's called
Johnson. My neighbours are Johnsons.
Of
In fact, my neighbour's the clan chief of the Johnsons, so there must be something in that.
He's called Minister for the Union. That's a title he took when he became party leader, wasn't it? Is he doing enough, as far as you know?
So we've obviously had, as you know, over the last 9 months, a distraction, or two distractions through Brexit and getting that finalised and COVID. But he absolutely has it at the forefront of the Whitehall agenda now. He's quite clear about that.
And Oliver Lewis now that is in charge of the unit in number 10 and Luke Graham's gone. That's all okay for you? You think that's okay?
Well, I don't think it's about who sits at the desks. I just don't think it is. That's what matters. What matters is what Whitehall departments are doing to strengthen the union. And that's what the Prime Minister cares about.
And you're content that the Tories can do well in the May election?
Yeah, Douglas Ross is going to fight hard. And actually, if you look at the opinion polls, he sits in a better place now going into these elections than the Scottish Conservatives did going into the 2016 Holyrood elections. So he's got everything to play for.
What if the SNP, the Scottish Nationalists, as you'll call them, they call themselves the Scottish National Party, they call themselves.
Well, I said the Scottish Nationalists or the Scottish National Party. You choose.
Okay. If they call the referendum, if they win the election in May and they go ahead and call a referendum within 12 months or whatever it is, what can you do? Can you just tell unionists not to take part and it becomes an SNP opinion poll? Or will you fight it?
Well, now we've been very clear, now is not the time. This is about the recovery from the pandemic, and that's what the United Kingdom needs. And we are crystal clear that a referendum is not on the agenda for us at the moment.
It may not be on your agenda, it's on their agenda. That's the problem.
On their agenda, if you look at their manifesto, in their manifesto, they will say that they're closing Trident down at Faz Lane. Now, that's reserved. It's our nuclear deterrent. Do they want to be part of NATO or not? It's a conflict for them. They don't have the power under the devolved settlement to close down Faz Lane any more than they have the power under the devolved settlement to encroach on constitutional matters, of which the referendum is one. So you can put these things in your manifesto, many things, but it is a devolved administration, and they have to stick to the competencies that are devolved to them.
They may want a court fight. It may be good for their base to take it to court, to go to the Supreme Court and have a battle.
Well, what I would say to that, Chris, is what's good for their base is going on about independence whenever they're in trouble and anything else. So whether it's the salmon sturgeon case, which to me, excuse the pun, looks a bit fishy, whether it's their failing education standards, their inability to build a ferry, their inability to deliver a hospital, their incompetence in government is always masked by bringing up independence whenever it suits them. And that's what they do. They immediately pivot to the Constitution to keep their core support happy. But actually, when you look at opinion polls, the Constitution is sort of 6 or 7 on people's list of priorities. That's not what they go to bed at night worrying about.
Why is she doing so well in the polls, Nicola Sturgeon, in that case?
I would take that back to Brexit. Brexit was, obviously, in Scotland, it was a less popular decision. And she's had the BBC Scotland have been very generous to her, giving her almost a daily political broadcast at lunchtime, which I think, as we get closer to the election, I call into serious question. It should be done by medical professionals. They're there, but does she need to be there when it's really medical and health information that's being imparted? I think there's a question about impartiality as we get closer to the period for a Holyrood election.
When's Purdah start for thee?
In March. I don't have the exact date.
Do you think she gets an easy ride from the Scottish press, Nicola Sturgeon?
There's no doubt in my mind that some of the press give her too easy. They don't question enough. I mean, there are people in Scotland, there are journalists who take, a really firm line. And then we have journalists across the UK who get Scotland, like Andrew Neil, who really step up to the plate. So, like everything in life, it's a balance. But I do feel sometimes, they don't always lead, especially the television media, don't always lead on what most Scots see as the most important story. But we've raised those concerns.
So examples being, maybe the slow rollout of the vaccine, or
I think their competence in government could be brought more to the fore and less, pivoting constantly back to a second independence referendum, which, as I say, is not on the agenda. What is critical, I think, to Scots is that we've done this amazing thing backing all these vaccines. And most of them, we've got a horse in every race, and most of them look like they're going to get to the finishing line, which will be great. We can then pass those vaccines on around the world, but also we can get our own population vaccinated, and we can, having protected their lives, we can then focus on protecting livelihoods. And I think that's what matters to Scots, is protecting their livelihoods and protecting their jobs.
Isn't the problem with unionist parties is the unionist vote is split between Labour, the Conservatives, and the SNP vote is always going to be, mid-40s, if not more, and therefore they're baked into power for decades hence, aren't they?
There is an issue with the unionist vote being split. There is no question about that. But there is only one party in Scotland that is standing resolutely against a second independence referendum, which we've talked about a lot in this podcast, and that is the Scottish Conservative Party. Labour are going through a leadership challenge. They are split on that, and they've been split on that for a very long time. And it's very clear that the one party who can defeat the Scottish nationalists are the Scottish Conservatives.
Why not offer Scots then a bit of more self-government, a bit more, maybe make the House of Lords into a Senate for the nations or something. Just give them a bit more. Then you might sort of take away some of that vote for the SNP and put the Tories into power in Scotland.
Well, I think that's a matter for constitutional review, and you're sort of stepping onto the area of a royal commission, and that's not on the government's agenda at the moment. I think what's on our agenda is showing a proper manifesto for government, and that's Douglas Ross's job leading us into the Holyrood elections, and showing that a more competent government that worked with Westminster would be better for Scotland. Scotland works best, and devolution works best, when the devolved assembly governments work with the UK government. And that's the problem we have at the moment. We have a government that don't want to work with us. Whether it was on free ports, we had to put pressure on them over that, potentially great opportunity for Scotland. Whether it was on the Union Connectivity Review and huge transport infrastructure benefits for Scotland, or the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill. 60% of Scotland's trade, which is over £50 billion, which is over 500,000 jobs, is with the rest of the UK, more than she does with the rest of the world combined. So, why would the Scottish government disengage their civil servants from talking to us about that? It was just reckless behaviour. Scotland's economy is hugely dependent on its membership of, part of the United Kingdom, and yet we have a Scottish government on these key issues not talking to us.
And just finally, Alister Jack, what do you think to these people who talk about a different federal structure to try and formalise the UK's unwritten constitution, to give a formal role for Scottish people more in government, and the Welsh and Northern Irish?
Well, I think the Scottish people have huge representation, not just in government, but actually in the civil service and in all walks of life right across the United Kingdom. This idea that Scots don't get out of the country and achieve anything is for the birds. Scots are leading in all aspects of our politics, business, society, right across the United Kingdom. What we need is a government in Scotland that wants to work with the government of the United Kingdom for the benefits of all Scots.
Will Scotland be in the UK in 10 years' time, Alister Jack?
Yes.
That was great. My last question. Alister Jack, Secretary of Scotland, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right. Stay with us, listeners. Coming up, we'll be talking about why we as a country are less keen to talk about our colonial past. Right after this.
Hello. Former England hooker Brian Moore here. Well, the Six Nations is back, and so is my podcast, Brian Moore's Full Contact. Each week we will get the biggest and best names from the world of rugby to dive into every ruck, maul and TMO decision. You can't nab a front row seat this year, but with our podcast you don't need to. So just search for Brian Moore's Full Contact on your podcast app, hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss it.
And we're back. Now, Britain's relationship with its colonial past has become an increasingly thorny topic, and the National Trust found itself right at the heart of the debate when it released a report on links between its properties and the British Empire and slavery. The report and the project that followed it, Colonial Countryside, was heavily criticised by some Tory MPs. notably a group that launched itself quietly last summer, calling themselves the Common Sense Group. They weren't happy that some of this work was paid for by taxpayer and lottery cash. And Sir John Hayes, who leads the group, called it costly, damaging and unpatriotic. Not a fan then. But one of the academics behind the study said this week that the work wasn't unpatriotic at all, and it's got nothing to do with guilt or blame. Her name is Corinne Fowler, Associate Professor at the University of Leicester. Corinne Fowler from Leicester University, welcome to Choppers Politics.
Thank you.
Great to have you on. Do you understand why your work has provoked such a reaction?
I really do. And I'm learning and listening a lot as well. I think it's coincided, or it appears to coincide, with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that also the countryside is a very beautiful place for us to escape to at the moment. So we don't really want to think about that darker side to our history, really.
Could you explain for listeners who may not be familiar with your work at Leicester University what your work's actually looked at?
So what my work's looked at is the colonial histories of the countryside. We tend to think about the countryside as being strictly local, but actually it has many connections to the rest of the world. So, for example, our moorlands, our country houses, even the plants which we find in the countryside and in our gardens are very linked to the history of the East India Company and also the slavery business and the transatlantic slave trade.
And you've done two pieces of work, Corinne Fowler, haven't you? You've done one called Colonial Countryside, which looked at the links between stately homes and Britain's imperial past. You've also done some work with the National Trust on its own properties, looking at links between slavery and colonialism. Part of this involved reverse mentoring. But what is reverse mentoring?
Well, it's something which museums have been trying across Europe for some 10 years. It's the idea that if you want to design something for children, for example, then the best people to tell you what they would enjoy are children. So my project was really designed, Colonial Countryside, as a child-led history and writing project so that children could both engage with heritage sites, because a lot of children at primary age aren't really that engaged with heritage sites or history, and there's a bit of a drop-off of interest in history as a subject. But also the idea of reverse mentoring was so that they could give us a child's eye view of what aspects of the history really interested them. So, for example, they rewrote a guidebook which had been written by adults for children about the colonial connections of Charcote Park. And they rewrote it word for word. And then he got other children to evaluate which guidebook they preferred. And they overwhelmingly preferred the one that the children wrote. So the child-led activity was really about getting the history across to children in a way that was resonant and meaningful for them.
Do they include the same facts that were in the other guide, or do they include facts that weren't in there, maybe about uncomfortable truths about the colonial past of that property?
They did include some fascinating facts. So, for example, there is in Charcote Park a painting from 1680 of someone called Captain Lucy and an African page boy who is about the same age as the children who were writing that leaflet. So they researched that history a little bit, and they read some stuff which had been produced by a local history group about that African presence in Warwickshire in the 17th century. And they included that in their guidebook because they felt they really identified with that child. There are some 300 paintings like that in our historic houses, and that's just one example. So it really intrigued them.
So in your what you're doing then is trying to draw attention to this colonial past that's hiding really in plain sight in a lot of these country properties.
Yeah, so one of the things you asked me earlier on was whether I understood why people find this difficult. And I think I do understand why. It's because we haven't really heard about it, even though the history of empire is quite integral both to our countryside and to a lot of our heritage sites and our historic houses and these beautiful estates. So I was interested in exploring that aspect of the history so that we can enrich and expand our knowledge of those sites. But obviously, if it's integral to to that site, for example, you've got Durham Park near Bristol. That was the home of one of the most important colonial administrators of his generation. So it makes sense to then explore that history and incorporate it into our understanding of those sites. And it's fascinating history too, because he was obsessed with the empire. He never travelled, William Blathwaite, to the empire, but he had a whole library of books all about different colonies. And he loved to receive seeds from these colonial governors that he planted in his garden, and then he displayed in his vases for guests and visitors to see all these exotic flowers. So it's really quite fascinating, the history of Chinese wallpaper, the history of swords from the Indian Mutiny, the history of the South Sea Bubble, and also the history of the African, Indian and Chinese presence so many hundreds of years ago. It's all quite unfamiliar to us, really.
Why is that? Why do we speak more, or why we talk more about the world wars and not about this key part of British history, the colonial time, the empire?
I think that's such a good question. One of the parallels that we might think about is perhaps Japan, thinking about how they treated prisoners of war, that's more uncomfortable for them to study and think about than for the sort of more obvious national successes. But I think that it's partly because at school, not many of us have learned that much about empire. We learn about slavery, for example, but we tend to focus on abolition rather than how formative it was in that much longer history of British involvement with slavery. It's perhaps just that we sometimes confuse patriotism with public relations, and history is something different. Because really, I think it's not unpatriotic to tell the truth or to look at evidence. And I suppose what really makes us alive is having curiosity about our past, and in its fullest sense.
You said in an article for the Sunday Telegraph at the weekend, which we'll put in the show notes to this episode, that you're not trying to weaponise history. But some people, maybe Tory MPs, have argued your work is doing just that.
I think that rather than being devices, this is a shared history. So my ancestors, for example, were slave owners in Haiti, and they were pretty nasty about it. But then there are the descendants of people who were enslaved in this country. So we can come together around these histories to really have a fuller, more global understanding of our past. And it's just really important not to weaponize this subject, but to talk about it sensibly and to talk about evidence and understand in the fullest sense our 400 years of being an empire.
When you said there that your ancestors were slave owners in Haiti, is that are you trying to right those wrongs now by drawing attention to the history of some of these colonial buildings in this country?
That is a really interesting question also. I've thought about that a lot. The strange thing about this was that I was writing my book, Green Unpleasant Land, about East India Company connections and the countryside and slavery connections, without realising that I myself, because I've got a French family, had connections both with the East India Company. Apparently we were captains on the East India Company's ships, and with Haiti. And I found this out when I'd nearly finished the book. So I didn't consciously set out to do it. But as I studied it more, I realised that so many of us are much closer to this history than we ever realised. And it's a lot closer to us and far less distant than we might anticipate. So I think it was a discovery, really.
Yes, I was struck by the fact that when Britain bought out slave owners in 1833, the government borrowed a long-term bond against the stock market that only paid out in 2015, which brings it right up into the present, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I was just going to add to that to say that it's true that we did only recently start paying back that loan, but it's also fascinating how much money from the profits of, so for example, slavery and the East India Company then went into really good things like building schools, hospitals, all kinds of infrastructure, quarries. It's really, really fascinating, those connections that we don't necessarily think about either.
Has the National Trust been happy with the work? They had quite a reaction against it from some members, haven't they?
I'm sure it must have been stressful for the National Trust, because although they commissioned this work ages ago, and they've been working on this since 2007, really, with the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, but it
Yes.
just coincided with the protests in the summer, and it all became very toxic all of a sudden. So, yeah, I imagine it must have been pretty hard for them.
Why do you think Conservative MPs have got so fired up about it? Do they see it as an attempt to undermine this country's history in some way? I'm trying to process it myself.
I think it's probably something to do with feeling proud of being British. And it's all got mixed up with ideas of patriotism, that if you're patriotic, you don't want to necessarily look at the less pleasant sides of our history. And sometimes I feel a bit sorry for Churchill, actually. He gets kicked around as a political football.
I know, it's a poor old Churchill. I'm speaking from the House of Commons today, where I do occasionally work.
Yeah.
Did you think it was unfair or fair to write him up into when Chartwell was mentioned, of course, in one of your reports there from the National Trust? Because he had a role in the colonies, didn't he?
Yeah, because he was Secretary of State for the colonies, and he also voted against the Indian independence. So, yeah, I mean, I think it was relevant, but obviously the problem with including Churchill was that then the other 92 houses in the report got a bit short shrift in terms of public attention. So, yeah, I mean, you can weigh that one up.
What they say to me, these critics, is that they think there are two things at play here: the empire, the colonies, and slavery. Empire, I don't know, was it a good thing or a bad thing? Discuss, but slavery was obviously clearly a bad thing. And what they appear to be wound up about is equating the two in the same sentence.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. I'm not sure who's doing the equating, really, but I suppose it's important to understand that East India Company history, for example, is but quite bound up with the slavery business as well. And all of that it's interconnected, because a lot of MPs had interests in both, for example, in Parliament, and lobbied in their own favour. But I don't think that it's a question of talking about whether it was good or bad. And we should maybe get away from this balance sheet approach to empire and just really understand empire in its fullest sense, because it's such a complex history spanning continents and decades and centuries that there are just many, many dimensions to it. And so it's important to look at it in its all complexity without thinking in terms of good and bad, really.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the report, the National Trust report you did have the words colonialism and slavery in the title, I think, which that's why they think you've equated the two, but they obviously are different.
Yes.
Maybe some critics might say that there's certainly a place for learning about the slightly less savoury aspects of our past, but is that place in country houses? Wouldn't it be better to say change the curriculum rather than using country houses as a vehicle for these lessons?
I think the most powerful argument for doing it is to look at the houses where aspects of empire were integral to that house's history, so that to not talk about it would seem rather strange. So, for example, if Penryn Castle was built with money from Jamaican sugar plantations, that seems a bit odd. If you don't then connect that to the history of the house, it would seem evasive or maybe slightly dishonest. And then other places like Basildon Park was built with East India Company money. So that, again, is fascinating. And it's got really interesting and intriguing stories about it. The connection with India was kept up, and there were barrels of mango chutney sent to Basildon Park. And I don't know why visitors wouldn't find that interesting. In fact, there was a survey done by the Policy Exchange that showed that something like 76% of National Trust members think that the colonial history of the property should be spoken about where relevant. I found that really interesting.
Has reaction been justified, do you think?
I think it's a very interesting moment in our public history. It's like the historian David Olusoga said, that suddenly there's a lot of interest in a man in Bristol, Colston, who died 299 years ago. And that's just the moment we're in. And I think it's important to just have those conversations, have them calmly and sensibly, and do what we can to improve our collective knowledge of our past.
You're not going to be shut down by these critics, are you, Corinne Fowler?
No. No, and I welcome the conversation. I think it's a good thing we're talking about it.
Corinne Fowler, academic from Leicester University, who's been stirring the hornet's nest by two reports about colonialism and slavery. And I can firmly recommend to anybody listening to go to the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. If you get a chance, it's free to enter, and it is shocking what you see there. Corinne Fowler, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all for this week. 2, I think, really interesting subjects. If you want to get in touch on either subject, please email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or tweet us @chopperspodcast. Thank you to my guests this week, Alister Jack and Professor Corinne Fowler. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you want to enjoy more of the Telegraph's brilliant political analysis and much more besides, please think about becoming a subscriber. Go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get your first month's subscription completely free of charge, and after that, pay just £2 a week. What a bargain. And as ever, if you enjoyed this show, please give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this show. And of course, if you can, please buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time though, cheerio!